Good evening, and welcome to your bonus episode of the Paranormal Encyclopedia with Kevin Mears. Now, I'm not normally going to do two videos back to back like this, but this is a topic that irks me immensely as a Christian, and I wanted to get it out of the way early. It's a pretty significant one for Christians everywhere, and it's really popular right now. So there are historians that claim that Jesus Christ is a made-up figure, that there's no historical evidence for him. This is ridiculous, and I'm going to get into why. And there are a lot of excellent sources you can find with a minimum amount of looking that will back me up on this. The theory has its roots in the 1800s, and a bunch of pseudo-scholars and pseudo-Egyptologists who basically made up a lot of nonsense, and then that got carried over. Today, it's most popular through a woman by the name of D.M. Murdoch, or as she likes to style herself, Akira S. If you've seen the movie Zeitgeist, which I don't recommend, that's pretty much lifts her theories and turns them into a movie. There's Bill Maher's equally badly researched movie Religulous, which also pretty much repeats the same fictional nonsense. But before I get into some of the nonsensical conspiracy theories, let's talk about the evidence for Jesus Christ. Well, the obvious beginning point for the evidence of Jesus Christ is the Gospels. Now, a lot of people go, oh, you can't use the Gospels, they're biased. Your point? If we were going to start arguing, for example, that Julius Caesar was just a made-up figure the Romans used for some reason, would you accept, we're going to just ignore all Roman references to Julius Caesar? Yeah, the Christians were biased, but that doesn't mean it's not a legitimate historical source. And it's not the only source. But we do have the Gospels. They were written within the first century. There's a lot of nonsense you'll hear about, oh no, they were written much later. But it's not true. If you go through the early church fathers, the leaders of the church in the first and the second century, they quote the Gospels, they quote the books of the New Testament extensively. And they quote it accurately to the text that we have. Yes, it's true, the oldest known complete copy of the Gospels comes from around the 4th century. There are some older fragments that have been found, but there isn't a single intact text. Most historians think that the Gospels were probably written around 95 AD, give or take. There's some variation depending on which one you're talking about. But they agree that they were based on earlier oral traditions. And again, if you look at these early leaders of the church, they knew the apostles. They knew the figures of the Bible. And here is the biggest myth that gets said about Jesus Christ. People claim that there are no non-biblical references to Jesus. This is a lie. I mean, there's no other word for it. It's a lie. Anyone who tells you that either hasn't done the research or is lying to you. For a start, there's a guy by the name of Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. He wrote around 60 to 70 AD. Now, Josephus was a radical, granted, but he was a Jewish historian. He's generally respected as a Jewish source. He refers to Jesus twice. Now, granted, the second reference was probably changed later by Christians because of some of the ways it refers to him. But most historians agree that both references originally talked about Jesus. They were probably changed later, but there is a chord there. And the first one isn't even that debated. It's talking about Jesus, this man Jesus. On top of that, there's Pliny the Younger, who's a Roman historian. Taciturn, another Roman historian. The Babylonian Talmud, which is a Jewish text that was written sometime between the 1st and 3rd centuries. It's written across hundreds of years. So when I say between the 1st and 3rd centuries, I don't mean we're not sure. I mean it was written throughout the whole time period. But it talks about Jesus. It talks about his life. It talks about him as this figure. So there are non-Christian references to the life of Jesus. Saying that there isn't is dishonest. Or lazy. Or both. Quite possibly both. So, And here's the other thing that the people that say Jesus didn't exist are ignoring. Okay, so yeah, there are these miraculous claims about this man Jesus. Yeah, then again, there's a lot of claims about people that we all accept as historical figures. For example, nobody really argues that Julius Caesar was a made-up character. Yet, Augustus Caesar said that Julius was the son of the god Apollo, and said that when Julius died, he ascended to heaven. And Augustus pointed to what historians now think was probably Halley's Comet, and said that was Julius ascending to heaven. So, child of God, divine return to heaven on his death. Nobody's saying the man didn't exist. There are other people in the time period of Jesus that claim to be the Messiah, that claim to have some of the same miracles Jesus did. Nobody, even the Bible talks about Bar Jesus, one of these people. Nobody's arguing those people didn't exist. We know that Herod existed. We know that John the Baptist existed. We know that the other figures mentioned in the Bible did exist. We're just picking on Jesus. And people will say, "Oh, I'm biased because I'm a Christian." Fair. I am a Christian. I'm not hiding that. But the people who are making these claims are just as biased. Just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're not biased. I'm not particularly trying to pick on atheists here, but Bill Maher and some of the other ones that are making these claims are admitted atheists. And that doesn't make them objective. It just means they have a different belief or a different opinion, if you prefer, than I do. And I'm not saying take my word for it. I'm not saying take anyone's word for it. Do the research yourself. Look up these names I'm talking about. Look at what other atheists say about Jesus. You can find, there's a very interesting movement out there called Atheists for Jesus, which are atheists, people who don't believe in God, who still like and support the teachings of Jesus as a moral teacher. These are people that believe Jesus existed who don't believe in God, folks. They have no reason to say that Jesus existed if he didn't. And that's the other thing. You'll see people claim that all these historians I talked about were in on some grand conspiracy. There's no evidence of that. In point of fact, Josephus and Taciturn and Pliny the Younger were outspoken opponents of Christianity. They knew the Christian religion had existed at this time. They knew about it. They weren't supporting it. There's no reason why they would be supporting. There's no reason for them to support this imaginary conspiracy that there's, again, no evidence of. So, let's talk about some of these goofy theories about who Jesus was based on, even though, as we just established, he's a historical figure. Because once we look at them, you can see they're even more ridiculous than they sound. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the figures that supposedly Jesus is based on. I'm not going to go over all of them, there's just too many. We're going to talk about Osiris, we're going to talk about Horus, we're going to talk about Buddha, we're going to talk about Krishna, and we're going to talk about Dionysus. I'm going to start with Dionysus. Dionysus is a Greek god. Now, supposedly, according to Akira and Zeitgeist, Jesus was actually based on Dionysus, or they were both based on the same previous god or whatever. Any of you who know Greek mythology, classical mythology at all, we're going to be laughing about this really quickly. Those who don't, again, look it up. Check what I'm telling you. Look up the legends about Dionysus. See how much they sound like Jesus. So Dionysus was born of the god Zeus. And this is the first supposed link is, well, he's the only begotten son. Okay, when Disney's Hercules is closer to the mark than you are, you're really mixing things up. Zeus had a lot of children. Jason, Heracles, to use the original Greek name, or Hercules, the Greek name, were half man, half god children of Zeus, as well as Dionysus. Dionysus eventually did become a god, as did Hercules, so this isn't something unique to Dionysus. There is also Ares, Artemis, Apollo, Hephaestus in some legends. There's a fair chunk of the Greek pantheon that were children of Zeus. The man is famous for his lecherous nature and having affairs with a lot of different mortals and goddesses. To say that he only had one begotten son is like, why is no one laughing at this idea? Really? So Dionysus wandered around, which is true. Jesus wandered around, also true. Jesus performed miracles. Dionysus performed miracles, for lack of a better word here. But let's see, some of the miracles. Jesus rose the dead. Jesus healed the sick. Jesus fed people, fed the many. Dionysus invented wine. Turned a bunch of sailors into dolphins. I must have missed that part of what Jesus did did I miss that part of the Bible? Most of Dionysus's most well-known followers were all women. Jesus's best-known followers, the apostles, all men. Now, he did have female followers, but Dionysus's most famous followers were the Manids. Manids were women that would get drunk and go into these orgiastic rages and kill people and tear them to shreds. Prince of Peace, followers got drunk and started murdering people. Yeah, real similar, right? When Jesus died, he went back to heaven. When Dionysus eventually became a god, which is a real important point. He didn't become part of Zeus. He didn't become some special status because he was the son of Zeus. Again, Heracles is also the son of Zeus, also became a god. He just becomes the god of wine and orgies. That's another thing he's fond of. Jesus orgies. No. Dionysus orgies, yes. It boggles my mind that people can take anyone who compares Dionysus and Jesus seriously after about 10 seconds of talking. Okay, let's talk about Osiris and Horus. So, Osiris is an Egyptian god of the dead, famously died, brought back. So he's been linked to Jesus. So Jesus died, was resurrected by his father. Osiris died, hacked apart by his brother Set. His wife put him back together. It's funny enough, he was separated into 13 pieces. She put 12 of them back together. And which one was the 13th? The 13th missing piece? How do I put this without getting crass? Yeah, it was his penis. I'm sorry if you find that offensive. It is the technical term. I'm not going to sit around and mince words and use cute euphemisms. Let's just call a spade, okay? So, Jesus ascends to heaven and sits on the Father's right hand. Osiris takes over the underworld, becomes the god of the dead, the judge of the dead. I'm not seeing the similarities. But then there's Horus. Horus is the child of the goddess Isis and the god Osiris. So here's the first obvious difference here. Isis was a goddess. She's the goddess of fertility and marriage. She is not a human woman. There's nowhere in the Bible nowhere in Egyptology that's saying she was an ordinary human woman. She was a goddess and she had great power. She put her husband back from the dead. Now, Horus was born after this resurrection. How involves magic and necromancy and other creepy things we don't necessarily want to get into here. But there are Egyptian sources that say that Isis was a virgin. There are Egyptian sources that say she had other children, that she had intercourse with her husband Osiris, because they were married before he died and came back. She may have had children had sex with other people. She was a god associated with fertility. Now, supposedly, this figure Apsu the Baptizer baptized Horus just like John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Yeah, first, we know even among people that claim that Jesus didn't exist, there really isn't any argument that John the Baptist didn't exist. Secondly, Apsu the Baptizer doesn't exist. It's not a figure from Egyptian mythology. It's somebody who was made up in the 19th century. Yes, Cairo will say, well, other Egyptologists have talked about this. Yeah, the guy who invented it. It's not something you can find in actual Egyptian folk legends. It's just made up. He wasn't baptized. He didn't have 12 followers like Jesus did. He was the god of the sun. He's associated with the god of the sun as well as the god Ra. He's not he wasn't famously the son of God. He wasn't the only god. They're not that similar. So, let's shift over to the east for a while, shall we? We'll talk about Krishna, and then we'll talk about Buddha. I'm going to talk, mostly I'm going to talk about Krishna first because Hinduism predates Buddhism, but Krishna is one of many incarnations of the Hindu god Vishnu. This gets complicated, but basically the god Vishnu keeps incarnating in the physical world in various forms. One of many of those forms was Krishna. Big difference. So, okay, both were God incarnate. Hinduism is famous for having many gods, although Vishnu is one of the most important, along with Brahma. And explaining all of this is getting far more into explaining Hindu religion than I want to, not because I have anything against Hinduism, but I'm not Hindu. I don't really want to start talking like an expert on a religion I'm not a member of, out of respect for the people who do believe in that religion. But the critical thing here is Murdoch claims that Krishna was nailed to a tree. Jesus, of course, was crucified, a common euphemism both scripturally and in the Roman period that we're talking about for crucifixion was being nailed to a tree. The thing is, I've asked Miss Murdoch before, I've asked her supporters before, I've never gotten a good answer to where does it say Krishna was nailed to a tree. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the most well-known and one of the most important Hindu holy texts, which describes Krishna's life, it says he was shot with an arrow. That's what killed him. It doesn't say anything about nailed to a tree. Additionally, another big difference between the two is that Krishna was a warrior. He was a soldier. Jesus was of course a famous pacifist. I'm not seeing the connections. There are some connections you could argue, but it's reaching. So when we come back from our last commercial break, we're going to talk about Buddha. Welcome back. So for our last look, we're going to look at Buddha. Now, first of all, and I want to say this about all of the other figures, because I have friends who are Hellenistic pagans, which means they worship Greek gods. I have friends who are Hindus. I have friends who, if maybe Buddhist, or at the very least have a lot of respect for Buddha. I'm not trying to badmouth any of these religious figures. I am not making judgments about their goodness or evilness or anything of that nature. I am strictly speaking about the supposed link saying that Jesus is just based on X. So Buddha is an interesting figure. He's, of course, the founder of Buddhism. And there are some very real similarities between his teachings and Jesus' teachings. And some similarity in their life. There's also some big differences. So, real briefly, Buddha was born to the highest caste in Hinduism, specifically the Brahmin caste. He was born to luxury. He was born to kings. He was born with servants. He was born with women to wait on his every need. He rejected that life and he went out into the wilderness. Now, here's one of those commonalities I'm admitting. Jesus went out into the desert. Buddha went out and sat underneath a Bodhi tree. Jesus was in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights fasting. Buddha sat under the tree for 40 days. While sitting under the tree, Buddha found enlightenment. Now, again, just like Jesus, there are Buddhist legends that Buddha was tempted by a figure called Mara, just as Jesus was tempted by Satan. Mara isn't Satan. The one that was tempting Buddha was the god of earthly pleasures, but he wasn't evil. He served a necessary function in the universe. He just represented the material over the spiritual, where Satan in Christian theology is undoubtedly a figure of evil. But Buddha developed the core foundations of the Buddhist religion. The Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is a way of living your life. The Noble Truths are the world is full of suffering. The root of suffering is desire. People suffer because they want of their desires, and by understanding and learning to control your desire, you can achieve enlightenment. Now, here's the difference. Where Siddhartha Gautama, the man who was eventually named Buddha, claimed that he was an enlightened man, and specifically claimed that by following the Noble Truth, the Eightfold Path, and the Noble Truths, anyone else could become enlightened. There can be many Buddha, according to Buddha himself. Jesus claimed he was the Messiah. He was, I and the Father are one. No one comes to the Father except through me. Here's another important difference. Buddha never claimed to be God. Now, there are Buddhist sects, and there's a lot of different Buddhist sects out there, and again, not trying to badmouth people, that some of them do recognize Buddha as a divine figure. But Buddha himself denied being God. He did not want people to worship him. He claimed he was someone who was enlightened, who had reached a state other people could reach by following his methods. Trying to say that he is God, you're missing the larger point that he was making. Buddhism is a very interesting religion in that it could be a religion and it can be a philosophy. There are people even out there that mix it with Christianity, mix it with other religions, or even Buddhists that consider themselves atheists. Because at its core, Buddhism isn't just embracing these philosophical principles. It's not directly worshiping Buddha or any other divine figure. Now, some branches of Buddhism, particularly Mahayana Buddhism, recognize divine or semi-divine beings. Some don't. There are a lot, just like there's sects of Christianity that differ on different things, there's sects of Buddhism. There's sects of pretty much every religion out there. But again, there's also evidence in not being an expert on Buddhism, and this not being an episode about Buddha. I'm not really going to be going into all of it, but there's evidence that there was a man named Siddhartha Gautama. There's evidence there was, as we've just gone over, there's evidence that there was a man named Jesus Christ. Were there similarities in their teachings? Yes. Why? There's all sorts of things we can go into. It's been suggested that Jesus may have gone to India and studied under the Buddhists in that time between when he was born and when he began his ministry, because there's some questions about what happened there, aside from what the Bible tells us, which is that he fled to Egypt. But it may also simply be that spiritual truths that lots of people have come to understand, the golden rule appears in most of the major religions in one form or another. Similarity doesn't prove causality. Or to use a common term that we're going to get into when we talk about the importance of skepticism when dealing with the paranormal, correlation doesn't prove causation. You've probably heard that, and if you haven't, get ready to be tired of hearing it, because I'm going to be saying it a lot. It's a mistake a lot of people make, and it's a dangerous mistake. But okay, so that's a brief rundown of all the different issues about, is Jesus a historical figure? We will probably be revisiting this at some point, because eventually, if not right away, down the road when this channel hopefully becomes a little more popular, I expect I'll be getting hate mail from people who are highly offended I would suggest that Jesus ever existed. And to those of you out there who think that, get over yourselves. If you could provide me sound historical basis to say he wasn't real, I'm all ears. If all you can give me is conspiracy theories by Akira and other nuts like her, I've heard it. I don't care. It's a conspiracy. You're right up there as far as I'm concerned with the people who think that aliens are abducting them and probing them. You need proof. And I'll be happy if you want. We can come back, revisit this, and I can be happily go through some of the atheist scholars who say you're full of it, and some of the other types of scholars who say that you're full of it. Jesus was a historical figure. This does not prove, nor am I saying it proves, that Jesus was the Son of God or Jesus was the Messiah. Those are religious, spiritual things that people have to decide for themselves. This is a purely objective statement based on historical data. There was a man named Jesus, more accurately, probably Yeshua. He was born in Nazareth. He was a traveling preacher. He wasn't a formally trained rabbi, granted, but he was probably, to some extent, apocalyptic preacher. The Sermon on the Mount probably happened, and he was crucified by the Romans. And his immediate followers, people who knew him in his life, claimed he was resurrected. Notice I said claim, I didn't say he was. I believe he was. That's a question of faith. But these are things that are historically documentable. You can do your own research. There's lots of wonderful books out there on the subject that can document Jesus was a historical figure. That's all I have to say on the subject for now. I hope you have a wonderful night. Again, if you like what I'm doing, please hit subscribe, hit like. Please feel free to leave comments. If you hate what I'm doing, feel free to leave comments and subscribe anyway and come back and make fun of me. Thank you so much. And again, I don't want to push this too much, but we need better equipment than what we're using now. We could really use your support. If you can head over to the Patreon link, which should be below, and support us even a little bit, it would be appreciated. Have a wonderful night, everyone.